The giraffe? Next door. Let me tell you about the month I went to war with my homeowners association over a giraffe. Not just any giraffe. Geoffrey, the 16-foot gentle giant who'd become the star attraction at the Pinewood Wildlife Sanctuary, where I've been director for the past 8 years. It started on a Tuesday morning in October. I was in my office reviewing budget proposals when my phone rang. It was Marcus, our head zookeeper. "Boss, we've got a situation in the African Savannah exhibit," he said, his voice tight with tension. Leo broke through the barrier between his enclosure and Geoffrey's. "Leo? The new male lion?" My stomach dropped. "Is everyone okay?" "Geoffrey's fine. We tranquilized Leo before anything happened. But the damage to the enclosure is bad. We need at least 3 weeks for repairs." I pinched the bridge of my nose. Where are we supposed to put Geoffrey for 3 weeks? And that's how I ended up with a giraffe in my backyard. My property sits on 5 acres at the edge of Meadowbrook Estates, a development that's still mostly unbuilt. My house was the first one completed, with the neighboring lots still under construction. The isolation was precisely why I bought there. Privacy from neighbors while still having the convenience of suburban amenities. The HOA had seemed reasonable on paper. I'd signed the standard agreement without much thought. After all, there was nobody to enforce rules yet. The HOA board consisted entirely of representatives from the development company. I had the perfect setup. A large fenced yard backing up to a small wooded area, completely out of sight from the main road. I built a temporary enclosure that gave Geoffrey plenty of room to stretch his long legs and access to the trees he loves to munch on. The first few days were uneventful. Geoffrey seemed to enjoy his change of scenery, and I enjoyed having my favorite animal as a temporary roommate. Then came the knock on my door. I opened it to find a woman in a crisp pantsuit, clutching a tablet like it was welded to her hand. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to be straining against her scalp, and her smile had all the warmth of a tax audit. "Mr. Richards, I'm Diane Hofstad, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association." She didn't offer her hand. "We've received reports of an unusual animal on your property." I leaned against the door frame, crossing my arms. "I'm the director of Pinewood Wildlife Sanctuary. We had an emergency with one of our enclosures, and I'm temporarily housing our giraffe here until repairs are completed." Her eyebrows shot up so far they nearly disappeared into her hairline. "A giraffe? In a residential area? Surely you're joking." "I assure you I'm not. The arrangement is temporary, 3 weeks at most. Geoffrey is perfectly safe and comfortable." "Mr. Richards," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper as if sharing a state secret, "our bylaws clearly prohibit livestock and exotic animals on residential properties." "Geoffrey isn't livestock," I corrected. "He's a critically endangered Rothschild's giraffe under the care of a licensed zoological facility. And again, this is temporary." "Temporary or not, it's a violation." She tapped at her tablet, then turned it toward me. Section 8, Paragraph 3. No resident shall keep or maintain any animals other than typical household pets on their property. I'm sure we can work something out. It's an emergency situation. Rules are rules, Mr. Richards. The HOA will need to issue a citation. Her smile returned, a little too eager. "The fine is $500 per day until the violation is remedied." I felt my face flush. $500? That's absurd. "Actually," she said, scrolling through her tablet, "since this is an exotic animal, which poses additional liability concerns, the fine will be $10,000 per day." "10,000?" I sputtered. "That's extortion." Her eyes narrowed. "It's enforcement of the rules you agreed to when you signed your HOA agreement, Mr. Richards. You have 24 hours to remove the animal, or the fines begin accruing." As she turned to leave, Geoffrey let out one of his distinctive calls from the backyard, a sound somewhere between a bleat and a trumpet. Diane jumped as if she'd been shocked. "What was that?" she demanded. That, I said with a small smile, was Geoffrey, saying hello. I spent the rest of the day on the phone, trying to find alternative housing for Geoffrey. The nearest facility that could accommodate him was in San Diego, over 500 miles away. Transportation would be stressful for him, and the cost would be astronomical. Every wildlife sanctuary within reasonable distance was either full or not, equipped for giraffes. That evening, I received an email with an official citation attached. The 24-hour countdown had begun. I poured myself 2 fingers of scotch and stepped out onto my back porch. Geoffrey ambled over, his graceful neck curving as he lowered his head to investigate me. I reached up to stroke his velvety muzzle. "What are we going to do, big guy?" I murmured. My phone rang. It was Carlos, my attorney and longtime friend. "I've reviewed everything," he said without preamble. "And I've got good news and bad news." "Bad news first," I sighed, taking a sip of my scotch. "The HOA agreement is ironclad on the exotic animals clause. If you fight this in court, you'll likely lose." I closed my eyes. "And the good news? The board can grant temporary exceptions for extenuating circumstances. You need to formally request an emergency variance." "How do I do that?" "I've already drafted the request. Check your email. They'll have to convene a special meeting to consider it, which buys us at least a week before they can legally enforce any fines." I felt a small flicker of hope. "Carlos, you're a lifesaver." "Don't thank me yet," he warned. "These HOA types can be vindictive. Be careful." After hanging up, I reviewed the variance request Carlos had sent. It was impeccably written, citing precedents from other HOAs that had granted similar exceptions. I signed it digitally and sent it off immediately. The next morning, my security camera notification pinged at 6:23 a.m. I grabbed my phone to see Diane and another woman I didn't recognize entering my backyard through the side gate. I threw on a robe and rushed downstairs, bursting through the back door just as they approached Geoffrey's enclosure. The giraffe was still sleeping, his long legs folded beneath him. "What the hell do you think you're doing on my property?" I demanded. Diane startled, nearly dropping the large bag she was carrying. The other woman, younger, with severe bangs and pointed features, quickly stepped in front of her. "We're conducting a safety inspection," she announced. "I'm Patricia Edmonds, HOA Safety Compliance Officer." "Safety inspection? At 6 in the morning? Without notice?" I advanced toward them. "That's trespassing. The HOA agreement gives us the right to inspect properties for violations," Patricia said, her chin jutting out defiantly. "Especially when there's a potential danger to the community." "Danger?" Geoffrey wouldn't hurt a fly. As if on cue, the giraffe began to stir, his big eyes blinking sleepily. "And you still need to give reasonable notice before entering someone's property." "We received complaints about loud noises during the night," Diane said, clutching her bag closer. "Residents are concerned." I laughed incredulously. "What residents? There are no occupied homes within a quarter-mile of here." Patricia pulled out her phone. "We have video documentation of the disturbance." She played a recording of what was clearly Geoffrey's call, but the sound had been amplified and distorted to make it seem much louder and more aggressive than it actually was. "That's been doctored," I said flatly. "Geoffrey makes noise occasionally, but nothing like that." "Nevertheless," Diane interjected, "we need to evaluate the enclosure for safety compliance." I stepped directly in their path. "No, you don't. You need to leave my property immediately, or I'm calling the police to report trespassers." Patricia's eyes flashed. "We represent the HOA, which doesn't give you the right to enter my property without notice at dawn. Now get out." They exchanged glances, and Diane's grip on her bag tightened. Something about it made me uneasy. "What's in the bag, Diane?" She clutched it closer. "Documentation materials." "Show me." "I don't have to." I stepped forward and reached for the bag. She jerked away, but not before I caught a glimpse inside. A container of what looked like antifreeze and several apples. Ice flooded my veins. "Were you planning to poison my giraffe?" Their faces gave them away. Patricia recovered. "First, that's a ridiculous accusation. I have security cameras all over this property," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Everything you've done since you arrived is recorded. Now, for the last time, get off my land before I call the police and—" "Have you arrested for attempted animal cruelty? A felony in this state, by the way." They retreated, Diane muttering something about hearing from our attorneys. I watched them leave, then immediately called Carlos. "They tried to poison Geoffrey," I said, still shaking with rage. "Jesus," he breathed. "Do you have it on video?" "Yes, and I got a look in their bag. Antifreeze and apples. They were going to feed them to him." "This changes everything," Carlos said. "We need to go on the offensive. I'm coming over." By noon, we had filed police reports and a restraining order against both women. My security footage clearly showed them entering without permission and carrying the suspicious bag. Though the video wasn't clear enough to definitively prove what was inside, their behavior was damning. "This should keep them at bay temporarily," Carlos said as we sat at my kitchen table reviewing documents. "But they'll regroup." "What's their endgame here?" I wondered aloud. "Why are they so determined to get rid of Geoffrey?" Carlos leaned back in his chair. "It's not about the giraffe. It's about power. New HOAs often go overboard establishing their authority. They're making an example of you." "Well, they picked the wrong zookeeper to mess with," I muttered. That afternoon, I received notice that the HOA board had denied my variance request without even holding the meeting they were required to. The notice also informed me that the daily fine had been increased to $15,000 due to aggravating circumstances. "They can't do that," Carlos assured me after reviewing the notice. "It's a clear violation of their own procedures. We've got them on that alone." But I wasn't interested in procedural victories. "I want to hit back harder." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" I smiled. "I think it's time the Meadowbrook Estates HOA learned what it really means to have a wildlife expert as an adversary." The next day, I installed an authentic emergency siren on my property, the kind used at the wildlife sanctuary to alert staff of escaped predators. I set it up with a motion detector specifically calibrated to trigger whenever a vehicle with the Meadowbrook Estates HOA parking sticker approached my property. I also reached out to every media contact I had accumulated in my years as zoo director. By evening, local news vans were parked outside my property, running stories about the giraffe under siege and the HOA gone wild. I gave interviews detailing the attempted poisoning, showing the security footage, and explaining Geoffrey's situation. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Save Geoffrey started trending locally, and by the next morning, a crowd of supporters had gathered at the entrance to Meadowbrook Estates, holding signs with slogans like "HOAs can't kill giraffes" and "Stand tall against bullies." When Diane's car approached the development that morning, she was met with boos and jeers. As she neared my property to deliver yet another citation, my siren blared to life, a piercing wail that could be heard for miles. She slammed on her brakes, nearly crashing into my mailbox. Seconds later, she was storming up my driveway, face contorted with rage, as the siren continued its ear-splitting alert. I met her on the porch, calmly sipping my coffee. "Problem, Diane? Turn that thing off immediately," she screamed over the noise. I took another sip. "It's a safety measure. Can't be too careful with trespassers around." "This is harassment." "No, harassment would be entering someone's property without permission and attempting to poison their animals. That sound familiar?" The siren finally wound down. In the sudden silence, Diane's heavy breathing was the only sound. "You've made a serious mistake, Richards," she said, her voice trembling with fury. By this time tomorrow, you'll be drowning in legal fees, and your precious giraffe will be confiscated. I set down my mug. Is that a threat? It's a promise. We've contacted animal control. They'll be here with a court order by morning. My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. Interesting approach. Too bad the county animal control director sits on the board of my wildlife sanctuary. We had a lovely chat this morning about jurisdiction over endangered species. Would you like to know what he said? Her confidence faltered visibly. He said, I continued, that a licensed zoological director housing a sanctuary animal during an emergency repair situation falls completely outside their authority. He also mentioned that filing false reports about exotic animal violations is a misdemeanor. It was a bluff. I hadn't actually spoken to the director, but Diane didn't know that. This isn't over, she hissed, backing toward her car. Oh, one more thing, I called after her. I've filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office regarding the HOA's violation of its own procedures in denying my variance request. They seemed very interested in reviewing your board's finances and decision-making processes. That part wasn't a bluff. Carlos had connections in the AG's office, and they were indeed looking into the situation. Diane's face went pale before she hurried back to her car and sped away. That night, I couldn't sleep. Despite my confident standoff with Diane, I knew we were far from resolution. Geoffrey was still legally in violation of the HOA rules, and eventually they would find a way to enforce them. Around 2 a.m., I heard Geoffrey making distressed noises. Not his usual calls, but something more agitated. I grabbed my robe and a flashlight and hurried outside. In the beam of my light, I saw two figures at the edge of Geoffrey's enclosure. I recognized Patricia immediately, and beside her was a man I hadn't seen before, tall and beefy with a crew cut. Hey, I shouted, running toward them. They bolted, but not before I caught a glimpse of wire cutters in the man's hand. They had been trying to cut through Geoffrey's fence. I pursued them to the street, where a car waited with its lights off. As they jumped in and peeled away, I managed to capture a photo of their license plate with my phone. Back in the yard, I found Geoffrey anxiously pacing his enclosure, visibly distressed. A section of the fence had been partially cut, not enough for him to escape, but enough to show their intentions. They weren't trying to free him. They were trying to create a situation where he would be deemed dangerous and in need of immediate removal. I called the police, but by the time an officer arrived, it was nearly dawn. He took my statement and the license plate information, but didn't seem particularly concerned. Sounds like a property dispute to me, he said with a shrug. You should work it out with your HOA. They tried to release an endangered giraffe into a residential area, I said incredulously. That's not a property dispute. It's criminal endangerment. The officer glanced toward Geoffrey, who had calmed down and was now peacefully eating leaves from a nearby tree. Doesn't look endangered. To me right now, look, I'll file the report, but unless something actually happens. He left the sentence hanging. The message was clear. The police weren't going to be much help. After he left, I reinforced the damaged section of fence and called Carlos again. They're escalating, I told him. We need to end this now. I have an idea, he said after I explained what had happened. But you're not going to like it. Carlos's plan was simple. We would use Geoffrey as bait. We would seemingly leave him vulnerable while actually setting up a sting operation to catch the HOA representatives in the act of trespassing and endangering an animal. We enlisted the help of 2 off-duty police officers Carlos knew, who agreed to stake out my property that night. We also set up additional cameras to cover every angle of Geoffrey's enclosure. Then I made a show of leaving my house, making sure I was seen driving away by Patricia, who had been watching from a parked car down the street. Instead of actually leaving, I circled back and entered through my neighbor's connecting property, making my way to a shed where I could monitor the security feeds. For several hours, nothing happened. Then, just after midnight, the feeds showed. 3 figures approaching from the wooded area behind my property. Diane, Patricia, and the crew-cut man from the previous night. They moved with deliberate caution, carrying large bags and what looked like tranquilizer guns. My blood ran cold as I realized their plan. They were going to sedate Geoffrey and remove him themselves. I texted the officers positioned around my property. They're here, armed with tranq guns, approaching from the south woods. The next few minutes were chaos. As the intruders reached Geoffrey's enclosure, floodlights suddenly illuminated the entire yard. The officers emerged from hiding, guns drawn, shouting for them to drop their weapons and lie on the ground. Crew-cut tried to run but was quickly tackled. Diane froze, dropping her bag, while Patricia inexplicably tried to aim her tranquilizer gun at one of the officers. She was swiftly disarmed and cuffed. I emerged from my hiding place as the officers were reading them their rights. Diane's face contorted with hatred when she saw me. "You set us up," she spat. "No, Diane. You set yourselves up when you decided to trespass and endanger an endangered species." I nodded toward one of the officers. "These gentlemen are very interested in what exactly you were planning to do with those tranquilizer guns, especially since none of you are licensed to use them." The search of their bags revealed not only the guns and sedatives but also documents, plans for the remaining vacant lots in Meadowbrook Estates. As it turned out, the real issue was never about Geoffrey at all. My property backed up to the last, undeveloped wooded area in the development, land that was supposed to remain natural as part of the community plan. But these documents showed the development company intended to clear it for additional houses, violating both their own proposals and county zoning regulations. They needed me gone before I discovered their plans, and Geoffrey had given them the perfect pretext to drive me out. The aftermath unfolded rapidly. Diane, Patricia, and their hired muscle were charged with trespassing, attempted animal endangerment, possession of illegal sedatives, and conspiracy. The development company tried to distance itself from them, claiming they had acted without authorization, but the documents told a different story. The county opened an investigation into the development plans, eventually revoking several permits and fining the company heavily. The HOA was placed under external management pending a complete restructuring. As for Geoffrey, he returned to the sanctuary 2 weeks later when the repairs to his enclosure were completed, ahead of schedule, thanks to an outpouring of community support and donations following the media coverage. On his last morning in my backyard, I sat with him as the sun rose, his tall form silhouetted against the golden light. He lowered his head to gently nudge my shoulder, a gesture I'd come to recognize as affection. "You stirred up quite a storm, big guy," I told him, stroking his spotted neck. "But sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air." Later that day, as the transport vehicle pulled away with Geoffrey safely inside, my phone rang. It was Carlos. "Have you seen the news?" he asked without preamble. I hadn't. He sent me a link to a local news article. The headline read, "Wildlife Sanctuary Director appointed to County Zoning Board after HOA scandal." Apparently, my stand against the corrupt HOA and development company had caught the attention of the county commissioners. They wanted someone who would protect both the community and its wildlife on the board that approved future developments. I looked out at the empty space where Geoffrey's enclosure had stood, then beyond to the wooded area that would now remain undeveloped. Sometimes, I thought, the most unexpected roommates bring the most unexpected opportunities. And somewhere in the wildlife sanctuary across town, a giraffe named Geoffrey was back home, blissfully unaware that he had changed the landscape of Meadowbrook Estates forever. 6 months later, I stood at the podium during the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new Geoffrey's Meadow Community Park, the previously threatened wooded area, now permanently preserved as a public green space. Beside me, Diane's replacement as HOA president handed me the ceremonial scissors. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Never thought I'd be doing this with the giraffe guy, she murmured. I smiled as I cut the ribbon. Life's full of unexpected turns. Just ask Geoffrey. On cue, from a special enclosure we'd built adjoining the park, Geoffrey's distinctive call rang out, drawing delighted gasps from the crowd. Some neighbors are worth fighting for, even the ones with spots and really long necks. The story shouldn't have ended there. Clean, neat, wrapped up with a bow. But real life rarely ties itself up so conveniently. 2 weeks after the ribbon-cutting ceremony, I received a certified letter. The return address made my stomach sink. The law offices of Hofstadt and Edmunds. Yes, those Hofstadts and Edmunds. Despite their criminal charges, Diane and Patricia had somehow managed to post bail and immediately set up a law practice specializing in, you guessed it, homeowners association disputes. And they had filed a civil lawsuit against me for defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The damages they were seeking? $10 million. I called Carlos immediately. After listening to me rant for a solid 5 minutes, he finally cut in. Relax, James. This is a nuisance suit. They're just trying to intimidate you. By asking for $10 million? I spluttered. That's a hell of an intimidation tactic. It's standard procedure for these types of cases. Ask for an outrageous amount, hope the defendant gets scared and settles for a fraction. His voice was calm, practiced. They know they don't have a case. They're counting on you being afraid of the legal process. Well, I'm not afraid, I said, though my racing heart suggested otherwise. But I am furious. Good, Carlos replied. Channel that. Because we're not just going to defend this suit, we're going to countersue. The following Monday, I arrived at the sanctuary to find a small crowd gathered at the entrance. As I approached, I realized they were reporters, at least a dozen of them with cameras and microphones at the ready. They swarmed around my car before I could even park. Mr. Richards, can you comment on the lawsuit? Is it true you used an endangered species as a pawn in a personal vendetta? Did you deliberately set up the HOA officials to ruin their reputations? I blinked, stunned by the barrage. What are you talking about? A reporter thrust a microphone in my face. Diane Hofstadt gave an exclusive interview this morning claiming you fabricated the entire situation to gain control of the development plans. She says you doctored the security footage and planted evidence. That's absurd, I said, trying to push through the crowd. The police have the original footage. There was no doctoring. She also claims you had a personal relationship with her. That went sour, and this was your revenge, shouted another reporter. That stopped me in my tracks. A personal relationship? I met the woman exactly twice before she tried to poison my giraffe. There was no relationship, but I could see it in their eyes. The scent of scandal had them salivating. Facts were secondary to the sensationalism of a scorned lover's revenge plot involving exotic animals and property development. I finally made it inside the sanctuary, slamming the door behind me. My phone was already ringing. The board chairman. James, what the hell is going on? I've got reporters calling about some love triangle involving you, a giraffe, and the head of an HOA? I dropped my head into my hands. It's not what it sounds like, Phil. It better not be, because it sounds like a PR nightmare. By the end of the day, Giraffegate was trending, and Diane had booked appearances on 3 morning talk shows. The lawsuit had been a calculated move, not to win in court, but to win in the court of public opinion. The next few weeks were brutal. Diane and Patricia proved to be masterful manipulators of the media narrative. They positioned themselves as victims of a powerful man who had used his connections to frame them. They cried on cue during interviews, talking about how their lives had been ruined, how they'd received death threats from animal extremists. Most infuriating was how they'd twist the actual facts. Yes, we were on his property, but only because we'd received reports of animal distress, Diane would say tearfully. We were trying to help the poor giraffe who was being kept in inhumane conditions. Our sanctuary's donations began to drop. Several board members started making noise about whether I should take a leave of absence until this blows over. Tour attendance fell by 30%. Geoffrey, oblivious to the storm circling around him, continued his daily routine of munching leaves and charming visitors. At least someone was at peace. I, however, was a wreck. The stress was taking its toll. I wasn't sleeping, barely eating. Every time I checked the news, there was some new angle to the story, some fresh lie I needed to counter. "We need to go on the offensive," Carlos advised during one of our strategy sessions. "They're controlling the narrative because you're staying silent. It's time to tell your side." "And who's going to listen?" I asked bitterly. "They've got the media eating out of their hands." "Not everyone," Carlos insisted. "There's a documentary filmmaker who's been reaching out to me. She specializes in environmental justice stories, and she's interested in the real story behind what happened." I shook my head. "Another person looking to exploit this circus?" "I've vetted her," Carlos said firmly. "Her work is legitimate, hard-hitting. She doesn't sensationalize. And she's suspicious of how perfectly packaged Diane and Patricia's story is." After much persuasion, I finally agreed to meet with her. Meera Patel, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor who listened more than she talked. "Here's what interests me," she said after I'd given her the bare-bones version of events. "Why would two HOA representatives risk criminal charges over a temporary giraffe situation? It doesn't add up." "It was about the land development," I explained. "They were trying to push through illegal changes to the zoning." She nodded slowly. "That's a start, but I think there's more to it. Mind if I do some digging?" "Be my guest," I said, not expecting much. I was wrong. 3 days later, Meera called me, her voice tight with excitement. "I need to show you something. Can you meet me at your attorney's office?" An hour later, I stared at the documents spread across Carlos's conference table, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. "These are shell companies," Meera explained, pointing to a complex web of corporate entities, all leading back to a holding company called Pinnacle Ventures, which is owned by... Carlos picked up another document, his eyebrows raised. "The Hofstadt family," Meera finished. "Diane's father is Martin Hofstadt, the real estate developer. And guess who their biggest competitor was in bidding for the Meadowbrook Estates project?" I felt a chill run down my spine. "Let me guess. The company that actually won the bid and started the development." Meera nodded. "Exactly. The Hofstadts lost the contract, but somehow Diane ends up as HOA president before any residents even move in. That's not normal procedure. She was a plant, I realized, put there to sabotage the development from the inside. And when you and Geoffrey accidentally exposed part of their scheme, they had to discredit you," Carlos added, the pieces falling into place. "It wasn't just about the wooded area," Meera continued. "According to these financial records, they've been siphoning money from the HOA maintenance funds into their shell companies. They were embezzling." The revelation changed everything. This wasn't just about a power-hungry HOA president, it was a sophisticated fraud scheme. And I had stumbled right into the middle of it. 2 days later, Meera's preliminary findings aired as an exclusive segment on a respected investigative news program. The reaction was immediate. Diane and Patricia canceled their scheduled TV appearances. Their lawsuit against me was quietly withdrawn. The State Attorney General's office, already investigating the HOA's procedures, expanded their probe to include the financial irregularities Meera had uncovered. Forensic accountants descended on the Hofstadt family businesses. The final blow came when Patricia cracked under pressure and turned state's evidence against Diane and her father in exchange for a reduced sentence. The full extent of the scheme was breathtaking. They had been running similar operations in 3 other developments across the state. As the truth emerged, the sanctuary's reputation was restored. Donations began flowing again, with many supporters sending additional funds. As an apology for doubting us, the board chairman personally called to apologize for wavering in his support. Mira's full documentary, Tall Tales, A Giraffe, Greed, and Community Justice, premiered 6 months later to critical acclaim. It detailed not just my battle with the HOA, but the larger issues of development corruption and environmental protection. Geoffrey became something of a celebrity. We had to hire additional staff just to handle the increase in visitors, hoping to meet the hero Giraffe. 1 year to the day after Geoffrey had first come to stay at my house, I sat on a bench in Geoffrey's meadow, watching children play on the new playground equipment that had been donated by a community fundraiser. My phone buzzed with a text from Carlos. Diane sentenced to 8 years. Father got 12. Patricia 18 months with possibility of parole in 6. Justice finally. A shadow fell across me, and I looked up to see a woman standing nearby, holding a small child's hand. "You're him, aren't you?" she asked. "The Giraffe man?" I smiled, used to the recognition by now. "That's me." She sat down beside me, her daughter clambering onto the bench between us. "We just moved into Meadowbrook last month. I wanted to thank you. If it weren't for what you did, this park wouldn't exist, and those criminals would still be running things." "Just looking out for my neighbor," I said, glancing toward the sanctuary visible through the trees, where Geoffrey's long neck could be seen above the enclosure. "Well, the new HOA is actually pretty reasonable," she said with a laugh. "Though, I did have to get special permission for my daughter's treehouse." As if on cue, Geoffrey let out one of his distinctive calls in the distance. The little girl's eyes widened with delight. Was that him? The famous Giraffe? I nodded, and she tugged at her mother's hand, begging to go see him. As they walked away toward the sanctuary entrance, I looked around at the thriving community space that had emerged from all the conflict. Sometimes the most unlikely catalysts create the most profound changes. In my case, it just happened to be 16 feet tall with spots. Some neighbors are worth fighting for, even the ones with spots and really long necks. And sometimes they end up fighting for you too, in their own unexpected ways.